this is Jenna Burt, host of the Confessions of a Military Spouse podcast. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to the Leadership Revolution podcast. We want to take a moment and say how happy and honoured we are that you have chosen to take time out of your week to join us today. We're excited to have you with us. If this is your first time listening, our vision is to build healthier families and communities through education and leadership, which begins by leading ourselves from the heart. We invite you to be fully present as you listen and judge later, because it's not easy to do both at the same time. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
So, Adrianne, I have a question for you. We're doing a series on where do we go from here, especially in the education sector. My question to you is, what actually led you into the education world?
That is an excellent question. So I think some teachers enter the education field quite on purpose, and I entered the educational field quite by accident, as I like to say. So I have degrees in English and a degree in endocrinology, and was looking to pursue a law degree, and woke up one day and just felt compelled to get a master's in education as a perpetual student. And I've come to understand, as not just a teacher, but also as somebody who hires teachers now, that some of the best teachers didn't end up in education on purpose. They ended up in education because they love learning and being a member of the learning community. And I think that's kind of how I ended up a teacher. And so I taught for 7 years before I was called upon to open a brand new school on the west side of my city, and had to get an admin license in what I'm told is record time, under a year. And primarily just to make sure that our service model was available to students in both quadrants of our city. So I went from teacher to admin, also sort of by mistake, never really planned on it, but happily here in my 4th year as a principal. And maybe most importantly, all 4 years as an admin, I have remained a teacher. So I've refused to give up my classroom. And it might be important to explain that my model of education, our students are partially homeschooled. So that makes it possible for me to run administrative roles ancillary to my educational responsibilities, because my students are working in partnership with their parents who facilitate homeschooling. Even pre-COVID, our parents were signed on to do some homeschooling. So that's how I'm able to do that. I also recommend caffeine and little sleep. Yeah. So that's my educational background. And here I am running a school now. I think I'm the youngest admin in this great state. And what a time to be an educator or a school leader.
Yeah, you said something that's very powerful, that a lot of teachers that you're bringing on have a love of learning, and that you have a love of learning. That's why you do, you're both an admin as well as a teacher. Now, what about learning specifically do you love?
I don't think anyone has ever asked me that. What I love specifically about learning is that I never know anything. And I want my students to know that I never know anything. I think one of the biggest pitfalls for any educator is this idea that education is teacher driven, and it really shouldn't be, in my opinion. It should be learning driven. And as a teacher, I know a lot about some things, but I have, I work with my students to ask lots and lots of questions. I mean, and that sounds sort of trite, like we want our students to ask questions, but we actually have a curriculum for training students to ask questions, metacognitive questions, and we have them collect data on themselves about how many questions they ask. And so I can take a lesson where I think I know everything I'm about to teach, and my students will totally pull the rug out from under me with how limited my knowledge is about every field. So what I love about learning as a person is that it never stops, right? And I think if you ever think you're done with learning something, you really probably should exit the field. It's the wrong attitude to have. My favorite thing about learning with kids is like the sound they make. Like, you know it when you hear it, because it's like or like, it's like totally like audible thing. It's my favorite noise in the entire world is that sound right there. There's nothing like it.
Wow. And I think it's so relatable. You talked about if there's not a love for learning, you should probably exit the field, and that, you know, you may not know everything. I think COVID has presented quite the challenge of how do we go, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
And with that, like, are you seeing the teachers around you facilitate or and that's not a good question. Have you seen the teachers around you have that same mindset, or have you encouraged them to have that student mentality that you talk about?
So I am so fortunate, right? Like, I built my school, kind of, I say brick by brick, but like, I mean, I literally hard-hatted this building from its beginnings to where we are now. And I got to hire my teachers. And so, I was really, I really like carefully selected people that I think share my passion, not for delivering instruction, but for learning with their students. And it really is it's a paradigm shift, and one that I think COVID is really emphasizing in sort of the inequities in classroom instruction across our country, because there's a lot of teachers that come from a traditional perspective of, I know everything I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to explain it to you, and then I'm going to assess how well you understood what I said. And that is a very old model. And interestingly, I mean, education is probably one of the few fields globally where we haven't really changed it much, despite exponential changes, in our planet, in our environment, and in our technology. We really haven't changed the model much, but my program is different, right? We're partially homeschooled. My classrooms are multi-age, and we really train our students to think and to ask questions and to push and to lead the instruction. And so I have to hire very particular people that are kind of comfortable with that. And so when you ask, how are my teachers handling that? Well, they're handling it really well, because they're used to feeling kind of on the edge of their knowledge. And it is a collegiate sense of what more can we learn from each other, and what more can we learn from our kids, who often have better ideas than we have about organizing things. And so having the right team of people who have aligned themselves to a mission that I'm really transparent about. We, like, our number one aspiration here is students making meaning and working in a learning community. And so if you're not here to be flexible and have grace and screw up audibly in front of your kids and learn together, then this wouldn't be the right environment for you. And so, and that was pre-COVID. And now I think that this crisis has really sort of forced other schools to kind of wrap their heads around a similar thing, that we really now are necessitated some changes to educational models. And I can only imagine what it's like for people who have a hard time dealing with that kind of change, either because you are not a flexible thinker, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Not everybody is a flexible thinker. People take time. Or because maybe the systems that are in place around you aren't flexible. And so I'm sure there are schools out there that don't have flexible systems. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you can't run online school and pretend like it's real school, right? You can't just like film a day of school and present that to students and be like, here you go, 6.5 hours. You have to change. You have to use your word, pivot. And our kids were pretty accustomed to some of these pivots, right? Like, they have really good ideas about how you can more effectively deliver technology education to them, because they are like so inundated with technology in a way that even my generation isn't. And so I kind of lost my frame here, but I think that we have to have flexible structures, and you have to train your people to align themselves to this idea that we don't know everything, and just like, you're here to learn and figure it out and work together. I went like 600 directions with that question, but I think I came back on an important point.
It definitely did. And something you said that struck a nerve with me And
circuit
nerve is just like, oh, this is good. You talked about you talked about traditional versus innovation, and you talked about, everything around us has evolved, but our education system is on that delay. And I think for the longest time, in my experience in public school systems and in the magnet programs, they have produced in me to be a consumer thinker. And I think what you're talking about is creating critical thinkers. And that changes things. It allows us to understand things versus just take things as gospel. And I think you're actually on the trend of where I believe our education system is going to go. So my question back to you would be, where do you think we're heading? Because we're converting classroom to just online, but students aren't as engaged. How do you think we're going to pivot from this?
Well, I think I took down, when I was just thinking about this question, I took down like 2 frantic pages of notes, and I tried to classify my pivots. Okay, so I'm going to brag on my program for a second. So I run a magnet school. And so we are literally under what's called the Office of Innovation. And so the name of the game for me is innovation. So I work under the Magnet Schools of America, and we are always looking for fundamental and radical reshaping of education. And that is how I have come about everything. And I think that part of my having a background that wasn't shaped by this idea of what it means to be a traditional teacher or a traditional administrator made it possible for me to just be we're building the plane as we fly it, as a magnet program, even pre-COVID. Mm-hmm. And so where does education go from here? Well, I think there's some really big problems that COVID kind of cracked open, and they were always there. And so I'm going to get to the critical thinking part of it, because that's super important to me. But I think education always was make or break about how engaged and healthy a family was. It's always been that way. Okay. But we just didn't always, it was always sort of we could handle it. We could make up for it if we weren't engaging the parents because we had the kid in the building. And when we stopped having the kids in the building, we shifted toward this pretty big crisis of we have to communicate, we have to get supplies to families, we have to open up all these new channels to make sure that we're actually building a relationship and a partnership now with all of these students who are now being asked to learn from a set of walls that we're not in control of. And so parents were always important, right? And statistically, students who have high parental engagement statistically do better overall always. And that's in partial homeschooling models like my own, or in full traditional kids are there 100% time. This was always true. But now kids are really all being homeschooled, sort of, right? And so that partnership and that communication is essential. And I can't imagine a teacher can ever look back and be like, yes, I'd like to go back to where I didn't have to talk to parents as much about how to make my students be successful in my online class. Because in order to make this work, you have to really talk to your parents. You got to know their schedule. If the kiddo's in a daycare, you got to call the daycare. You got to know who that homeschooling quote unquote parent is. All across the nation, right? Everybody's quote homeschooling, sort of, one way or another. They're calling it distance learning or whatever they're calling it. I have students that are learning out of daycares. Yeah. And so we're calling the daycare leader, and we're like, how can we help you? Can we meet with you weekly? So my first thing is that I can't imagine we should ever want to go back to a world where we think our kids only exist inside our classroom, and we're not forging, tirelessly a partnership with those parents who we statistically know are the make or break for those kiddos and their success. And parents care, all of them care, whether or not they have the ability to throw themselves into partial homeschooling, or if they have the funds to put their kid in daycare or whatever, they all care and they all want to be a part of it. And so now we've got sort of, I want to say universally, although I'm sure it isn't yet, some universal understanding that kids need devices and we need access to their parents. And we're building digital literacy in families so that we can do what you and I are doing right now in Zoom, and our kids are in online lessons. And there's just no excuse for not knowing your family anymore, because now you can meet them on their time. Mm-hmm. You can talk to them when they are available. And if teachers, and this is a big if teachers can be flexible on their contracts which I won't get into union stuff, but if teachers are willing to put in the time that it requires and some flexibility in their scheduling, you can meet your kids anywhere and give them what they need. And you can meet those families anywhere, and we can really get to know them. Like, those platforms are now in place in a way that they weren't before, right? Like, pretty much everyone knows what Zoom is now. And like 6 months ago, none of us had ever freaking heard of it. But to get to the critical thinking point, which is like so important to me, the most innovative thing in the world out there in terms of, let me restate that. Whenever I attend any kind of class about innovation or any, symposium about innovation, critical thinking is what everyone talks about. And it's like so obvious, right? Like, we want to train our kids to be able to think because, essentially, especially now, we no longer have any idea what we're preparing them for. And I mean, the only certain thing is that you and I have no idea what the future looks like. And that was true a year ago, right? Considering exponential growth of technology, exponential global integration. We never really knew what the future was going to look like. But like, now we really don't know. And most sectors are changing rapidly to meet with growing demands and just like exponential changes, right? And you and I can make no predictions. And as a teacher, I can make very little predictions about what kind of field I'm actually preparing my real life human students for. Like, these are real live human children that are going to enter a workforce in like 10 years. And I have no idea what that's going to look like. So there are some fundamental things I think are important for them to learn. But like, the absolute most important thing is that they know how to think no matter where they are, right? And this is what the world looks like now, right? Like, I attend all of my administrative meetings like exactly like this on a computer, talking to people in a screen, right? So I need to prepare them for that. I need to prepare them for the digital etiquette of like the real life that they're probably going to be, we're most likely going to experience a lot of digital integration in our future because, probably pandemics like this are going to be a reality for us in some way, shape, or form. And so I have a hard time believing we won't cycle back to technology integration. My point being, kids have to know how to do this. They got to know how to collaborate online. They've got to know how to ask questions, problem solve, use resources, and there are curriculums for that. Like, we have a curriculum for critical thinking. So when I say critical thinking, I literally have a way that we teach that and document and grade it. And not all schools do, but it's a hallmark of a school that is actually pushing critical thinking, and more so than just saying, we believe in critical thinking. Like, you have to actually metric that. And yeah, so we don't know anymore what we're actually preparing them for. So they have to be ready for anything, right? And I think some days I think like, man, knowing how to think and how to ask the right questions and how to get what you need is more important even than learning like the content. Like half the time I'm like, I believe in teaching math. I love teaching math. It's my favorite thing in the entire world. And I'm building math literacy in my students in a really active way. But at the end of the day, like, I need them to know how to problem solve more than I need them to be able to do long division. Somebody somewhere would like hit me if they heard me say that, but I think it's true. So what I'm seeing is like, districts are pivoting toward things that my program as a school of innovation was always doing. And now they're like big out there, and it's because they're the highest leverage. They're what works. Like, if you only have your kids for a few hours a day on the stinking computer, your lessons can't be fluffy stuff anymore. It can't be you talking. It's got to mean something because you only have them for a little bit. So highest leverage is what's important. We need to drop the junk that doesn't matter, and we need to leverage our instruction to be about what kids really need. And what they need is not for me to do exactly what I'm doing right now, which is like talk a lot. They need me to shut up, and they need to be given the opportunity to talk to each other and to think through things together. And for me, teacher, to just listen and buffer, of course, and guide. So like, I'm going to just throw some education buzzwords out here, but like, these are the curriculum that my program is built on. And my program has existed for 30 years, right? Like, my building is a new iteration of it, but this program's been here for 30 years. And we're built on problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, service learning, project-based learning, digital collaboration. And now everyone says this blended instruction, which is to say that students learn at home. So you should also leverage what they're doing in their lives at home, right? And this is what now these are like, wow, these would be great ways if we could figure out how to do this, out universally. this is what education has looked like in some buildings for a long, long time, is teaching kids how to solve problems collectively, how to inquire, how to engage authentically with their community to solve real problems out there. And then you can make it cross-curricular. You put the math, the reading, the writing into those projects and those real world problems that they're solving, you know? And so if you look up, if you start Googling schools out there like Mind Magnets, you know, most of them are built on getting kids to engage with their real communities. And all the math and reading and writing they need is in there, and it's still standards based, and it's still accessible, and they can still take standardized metrics, you know, those big fancy standardized tests that are required. All of that can be done through what I don't think is that innovative. I think it's sort of common sense in education. Prep them for what the world really looks like, which is not sitting and listening, unfortunately. Although that's what you're doing right now. So I guess I hope to see that we hybridize this, that people who have been traditional, that these models that have been traditional learn to be more flexible and start preparing the kids for the real world, you know, and the real world that could have future pandemics, a real world that is on the brink of global climate crisis, you know, a real world that's being driven into major divides, sort of globally, wealth divides, education gaps. You know, we have to prepare our kids for some real things out there, and it can start now.
I extracted 5 points from everything you shared. And I think for our listeners who are happening to take notes, or you can read because this is internet radio. Number 1 is create partnerships with the parents to facilitate the student success. And COVID has exposed that and shown how important that is. Number 2, digital learning for the 21st century and digital integration. It is key on where we go from here. Number 3, flexibility with the teachers to connect with the parents anytime and anywhere. And the digital platforms like Zoom give us that opportunity. Number 4, prepare students to think, and versus just hard skills of understanding, okay, I know how to work a Microsoft or I know how to work the computer, but what are the strategies that become transferable? And you talked about asking the right questions, collaborating. Those things can be transferable anywhere, especially in the 21st century. And number 5, leverage the instruction. Teachers need to become guides from the side instead of sages from the stages. Did I get all 5?
You got all 5, yeah.
All right.
I think I like that. I wrote down not a teaching culture, but a learning culture.
Yeah.
And just one thing I would add is this idea that, you know, education is not just my responsibility as an educator. It's not just the parent's responsibility as a parent, right? It's this sort of collective community thing. And something kind of cool that's happened in COVID is like whole communities are rising up to support working parents, to support, you know, blistered educators. And, you know, we're seeing some kind of cool things happening. I mean, there's like local education broadcasts on television networks all across the country that are synchronized to teaching schedules. You know, you're seeing like programs that are working with school districts, and I hate this word, I'm so tired of the word unprecedented, but it is unprecedented, you know, that we have like internet providers partnering with schools to get free internet into the homes of disadvantaged students across like my whole city. You know, we have digital hotspots and also 6 months of free internet access, and then discounted internet access, which I'm sure will continue to be. I mean, I don't know why that wasn't always a thing. You know, it should be a global utility, I think, but we're seeing community partnerships being forged that maybe weren't always there and leveraged, and it's been kind of inspiring to see how these organizations are stepping up also, you know, and what I hope to see is that employers start figuring out how to support working parents in a way that we haven't before. You know, I've been preaching the words flexibility and grace to my staff because we get really impatient with our parents, we get really impatient with our kids. Worst of all, we get really impatient with ourselves, right? And they're big words, but if you say them a lot, it feels better. Like, I'm being flexible and I'm having grace. And, you know, this idea that we have whole communities that have been looking at parents now in a different way because parents are doing something that's really freaking hard. And parents are looking at teachers now like, wow, you were doing something that was really freaking hard and educating my child. And I hope that we start building systems that take better care of, you know, probably the most important enterprise in our nation is educating the future taxpayers, right? So, you want them to be informed voters, you want them to be educated individuals. Well, you got to make sure they get a good education. And in order for that to be possible, there need to be supported educators and supported parents. And if you drive a working parent to the ground and make every system impossible for them to educate their children, then you are not setting up your future for success in any way, right? We're creating a whole generation of kids who are disadvantaged because their parents were working full time, right? So I hope to see that more industries become flexible with this idea that parents need to be able to do their jobs and educate. And I've seen some cool things happen. Daycares and community centers opening, giant classrooms for kids. So if all the kids have their devices and all the kids have their schedules, which hinges on that communication thing I mentioned, right? Really clear communication from teachers to parents, then those kids can go learn in these classrooms, distanced from one another in a daycare, while their parents are working if they can't be in schools because schools are closed. Some cool things like that, partnerships in the community. So that's my 6th point to add to your, is that education, radical education is a community endeavor.
And you said, and I love the perspective and where you're looking at the world, because I've connected with a lot of educators, and there are some who are looking at it through very, very negative, right? For lack of better words. And you're talking about what's becoming of it. And oftentimes people are saying, I want to go back to the way it was. And and I know that's no bueno. It's like saying, I want to use a VCR again, and while we can stream music online. And perspective is everything. And you shared some very inspiring perspective on how the community's rallying behind each other, how they're actually understanding a teacher's perspective and an administrator in the school. But I want to ask this question because I know you said it earlier on in our conversation that you're both a teacher and an administrator. Like, how do you balance both of those things?
Well, very few people do. So when I finish my doctorate here one of these days, it's my dissertation work will be in the teaching administrator because I think it's the most important thing I do. Like, my staff recognizes me as one of them, right? Like, I never left the classroom. It's everyone's complaint about an admin is like, oh, well, when was the last time you were in a classroom, right? Like, they don't know what it's really like. Like, I do know what it's really like, man. So I have a schedule that is built that it is possible primarily because of my ability to do, my students are partially homeschooled. So during the time that they are homeschooled is when I lump my administrative roles. Mm-hmm. But I could, if, as long as I've got that 1 day a week, right, where my students are homeschooled and I can manage all my administrative tasks, then I got my other 4 days to teach. Then I'm fine. So how do I balance it? Well, I consider my classroom a lab for how I'm going to help my teachers grow. So anything I'm doing in my classroom, I'm documenting and gathering data on my mistakes, my adventures, the things that, I totally screw up as I'm creating all of these action research projects within my own classroom. And I don't do that on my own. All of my teachers do it. We're all researching our classrooms together. And so in collaboration, I come back and report what I'm learning, and we develop pretty organically systems that we use school-wide. So I view my teaching as my most important role as an administrator, because my teaching practice informs how I lead my teachers to be better at what they do. And honestly, I make this joke, but it's super true because I get to observe all of them. I'm like the best teacher because I get to pick up all their best traits. I'm like, I learn from all of you. I get to steal all of your practices, and I get I get to be super teacher because I've got this hybrid, all these practices. But then what I do is I convey all of what they're learning out to one another and set them up for that. So that sounded so arrogant, but I mean, I'm mostly joking, but I get to learn from them. I get to learn from my own students, and we get to grow that way. And I'll never give it up. I think teaching is the most important part of what I do as an administrator. So that I can really authentically lead my teachers in, this pursuit. I don't view myself as an operational manager. I mean, there are operations and budgets and things I have to manage. I view myself as an instructional leader. But a lot of my teachers are better at this than I am. And so I'm able to learn from them and transmit their knowledge onto the rest of the staff. And so we get to work together like that. So in a way, we're kind of like a little lab, all of us. And I have 17 teachers, so we're tiny. That might be important for your listeners to know. I have 250 kids, so I'll hit 300 when I'm done expanding. We've just been growing here year by year as a new school. So we're little, by comparison to most programs. And so we have this advantage. We're able to work really closely like that. Your question was really very different than how I answered it, which is how do you balance it? You don't ever really balance it. Give up the idea that there's ever balance, right? It's always more like it's like an ebb and flow of what gets more of your attention at a certain time, right? And that's important, I think, for any teacher, especially if you have your own kids. There's no such thing as balance. Give it up. Just do your best at whatever you can do your best at when you can.
And that's why I think you were saying multiple times, I think you said it at least 100 times, flexibility, because there's no such thing as balance. And it's interesting you say, you're an administrator as well as a teacher. And I find it incredible because when I was a college athlete and I played a little professional, it meant so much to us as athletes where the coaches actually played the game versus coaches who just learned the game in a textbook. So they could understand what it meant to be in the fourth quarter and when the pressure's on and you're down by 7 points. And what do? You rally together, you focus on the vision, and then you pursue it collectively. Versus a coach is like, well, I read it in page 17 and I think you're supposed to do this. It's just, so it changes the dynamic, as the leader as well as the people who are following the leader. Now I have my last question for you today, and I want you to think about this very deeply, right?
Okay.
What are your thoughts and what do you think about academic tenacity, and how do you feel that is relevant today?
Academic tenacity? I feel like I have to look up what you mean when you say tenacity. So what do I think about? Sorry, go ahead.
It's like grit.
Yeah. Okay. So academic grit, generally speaking, tenacity generally speaking, is essential completely, right? Like we just learned that without warning, the entire world can be completely changed overnight. Like one day we all packed our bags from work, went home, and didn't go back for a long time. So I think having the ability to persevere is incredibly important. I mean, I think it's going to be the bedrock on how we recover from future changes. And I mentioned earlier my dire warning here about climate crisis. And I mean, I've heard the word unprecedented so many times on the news this week that it's upsetting me, unprecedented fires in California, unprecedented hurricanes on the East Coast, unprecedented global pandemic, right? So these things are all, I think, linked to the fact that we put so much pressure on our globe that it's fighting back in a way that it's getting exponentially worse. And it's going to take some unprecedented tenacity to deal with a planet that is shifting in a way that we don't like. And there's not a whole lot we can do about it. We're going to have to persevere. We're going to have to develop new systems, not pine for old ways, because old ways are burning to the ground in California, are globally melting down in our healthcare systems and our responses to a pandemic, that the old ways are not working. So I think tenacity, grit, however you would like to define that, in academics or otherwise, and academia is everything. I mean, it's, in the pursuit of knowledge and progress is going to make or break our country, not just our country, but the globe, health, everything, the success of our species. So that's I know there's my humdinger on the end of that one. I went from real optimistic to, oh my gosh, we've got to do something about this climate crisis. But we do. And my hope is that we continue to educate our kids for the real world. And this is what I mean is they're not entering the world that our parents might be pining for, right? When things were simpler. They are entering a world where, we need to be thinking proactively about how to completely overhaul our measures here. I mean, look at how much we're saving just by doing the UN's meeting and their global summit online. Think of how much pollution we're not creating by having all of those global leaders do it on the computer. And it might be different and it might be challenging, but how much emission are we reducing by changing some of our old ways? So that's what I'd like to say about that. Maybe some of what we were doing before kind of sucked, and we can adapt and improve instead of instead of wishing, things were back to how they were. Normal or the before times doesn't necessarily mean they were healthy or better.
Yeah, it's just like when Apple introduced the iPhones and we didn't know how bad we needed smartphones because we carried around all of these dumb phones, and now we're just like, I can't be without my phone in a way. And I said, are you an Apple user?
I am an Apple user. Yes. The whole ecosystem, like I'm full of through and through.
You know how important it is. And you have the capability to access the entire world at your fingertips versus, back in the days, having to wait to go to the library or reading an encyclopedia to get research information. And I think that's where we're trending now. But thank you so much for being part of the series, Adrianne. I am really grateful, and I know our listeners are going to appreciate what was shared today. Thank you again.
Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So for those who are listening, join us every other Wednesday for a new episode. We're continuing the series, Where Do We Go From Here? And I want you to remember something. If we as leaders are to set ourselves apart, we must start by leading through love, which always comes from the heart.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Leadership Revolution podcast. We hope you were blessed. We value feedback from our listeners, so please leave a comment letting us know what you found helpful, challenging, or left you wanting to know more. New Leadership Revolution messages will be released every other Wednesday. Hit subscribe to be sure not to miss out. To stay in the know on our latest news, events and initiatives, follow Shepherd Revolution on Instagram, TikTok and Facebook. Thank you again for coming on this journey with us. We love you, and as you go about the rest of your day, we bless you to lead from your heart.